questions hanging over the meeting of international leaders in Istanbul is what to do about foreign fighters who travel to Syria and Iraq to join Daesh. More fighters joined the group from France than any other European nation, meaning it now needs to find a way to reintegrate hundreds of people who spent years in the conflict zone. Elena Casas reports from Paris.
This prison wing in western France has been adapted to hold a specific kind of detainee, prisoners considered too dangerously radicalised to be housed with others. Around a dozen people will be held here by the end of the year, all with terrorism convictions and some who have returned from Iraq and Syria. It's part of a new strategy by France's government to persuade convicted terrorists to abandon extremism.
In total, 78 buildings will hold radicalized inmates. With specially trained staff, security will be high. Particularly dangerous individuals will be held in quarters for violent inmates, which will be sealed off completely.
The French government has long been aware it has a problem with religious extremism in its prisons. The Charlie Hebdo attackers, for example, came under the influence of an extremist imam while jailed. There are about 1,500 prisoners in France the government considers radicalised. Of those, about 350 have been jailed after returning home from fighting with Daesh in Iraq and Syria. They're receiving specialist counselling from psychologists, social workers and imams.
I think the presence of imams is important, both in prevention and in persuading people away from violence, because a lot of people who become radicalized have little religious education, so they just accept the whole discourse they hear from Daesh.
The government is set to announce a new plan to create a central body for the training and organisation of imams by the end of the year to try and counter the influence of extremist groups, especially in the country's troubled suburbs known as banlieue. Many of the French nationals who travelled to Syria came from areas like this in the Paris suburbs, where high unemployment and limited prospects have been blamed for pushing young people towards extremism. But locals say that by focusing on areas like this, the government risks increasing feelings of stigmatisation and alienation. Radicalisation isn't just an urban problem. 20 young men left this tiny village in the south to join Daesh in Syria. French authorities now say they've learned from previous mistakes, but they're not certain if they'll ever be able to reintegrate returned fighters back into French society. Elena Casas, TRT World, Paris.
Let's get more on this. We can speak to Dr. Afzal Ashraf, who's a former Royal Air Force officer and visiting fellow at the University of Nottingham's Centre for Conflict, Security and Terrorism. Good to have you with us. Our report there talking about France, but we know that thousands of European foreign fighters come from pretty much 4 countries, UK, France, Germany and Belgium. Why those 4 in particular?
I think it's because these are the 4 countries where we've had populations where there are Muslim communities, but also some mosques. Amongst these are radicalized mosques and radicalized preachers. So they're a tiny proportion of the overall population in these countries, but in the cover of these communities, some of these politicized individuals have begun to carry out their radicalization activities.
And governments, as we know, are trying to bring in policies to counter radicalisation at home. France, for example, talks about creating an Islam of France. Do any of these policies work? Do they have an impact?
There's no evidence that these sort of policies work, and in fact, in my personal opinion, having a state form of religion is absolutely the wrong thing to do. What I think the French government should do, and all the other governments should do, is come down very hard on those preachers that politicize religion, because in the Western context there is no room for mixing religion and politics. And I think that is an area that France can legitimately enforce, because that is part of the French culture and political constitution. What it shouldn't do, and what I don't think anybody should do, is to try and impose one version of Islam over another. What needs to be done is to encourage freedom of religious debate amongst the Muslim communities. And if you look very carefully amongst the Muslim communities in Europe and elsewhere, they are increasingly dominated by politicized versions of religion. So the preachers are wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, preaching politicized versions of theology, which is the danger. And so I think it would be very important for any state to be very clear about what it should and shouldn't do. It should not interfere with religion, but it can equally demand that religion doesn't interfere with politics.
And given the fact that, you know, safe havens for Daesh in Syria and Iraq, that territory has now been vastly reduced. How much of a threat do these returning fighters now pose to Europe?
Well, it probably won't be a huge threat, but then the big problem with terrorism is that you only need one person to commit an act which most people find unacceptable. So to quantify the threat is very difficult because the threat is all about perception. But I think that they certainly pose a challenge in terms of whether they should be accepted in the country in the first place. And to accept them, even those that don't pose a threat, is going to face the states with a considerable political and security problem, because already we're seeing a backlash in all of these countries, particularly in the UK and France and Germany, with right-wing extremists who are saying, why should the state pay 50 to 100,000 pounds a year or equivalent in euros for these people who have openly been disloyal to the state. So there is a political challenge, there is a security challenge, and of course there will be longer-term societal challenges in terms of reintegrating these people. So I think the best thing is for the state to recognize those challenges and start to address them from the top in terms of leadership.
Afzal Ashraf, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to get your thoughts there. The United Nations says half of all the people in Yemen could soon be on the brink of famine. The UN currently coordinates the delivery of aid to around 8 million people in the country. The humanitarian crisis has been deepened by a collapsed economy and continued fighting between Saudi-led forces and Houthi rebels around the port of Hodeidah.
There is now a clear and present danger of an imminent and great big famine engulfing Yemen, much bigger than anything any professional in this field has seen during their working lives. Some people, perhaps including some of you, will be thinking, hang on a minute, they told us this before and it didn't happen. That's correct. We warned of famine in Yemen at the beginning of last year as part of the Secretary-General's call to action, which also flagged the risk in